What if I told you that millions of Germans were turned into refugees, starved, imprisoned, and even killed after the war had already ended, when peace was supposed to begin? The fall of Nazi Germany in 1945 didn't bring peace for everyone. For many ordinary German civilians, mothers, children, elderly men, the end of World War II marked the beginning of a new nightmare, one not caused by bombs, but by retribution. While much of the world celebrated the fall of Hitler, millions of Germans faced unimaginable punishment, from mass expulsions and starvation to the horrors of rape, internment, and exile. The consequences were shocking, yet history rarely talks about what truly happened in those chaotic post-war years. In this video, we'll uncover the shocking truth behind what happened to Germans after 1945. From violence by Soviet troops to mass deaths during forced migrations, you're about to discover one of the most overlooked and brutal chapters in modern history. 1. Germany in ruins. By May 1945, Germany lay in absolute devastation. Cities like Berlin, Dresden, Cologne, and Hamburg were little more than piles of stone and dust. 7 million Germans were already dead, yet for the remaining millions, their struggle for survival was just beginning. Civilian infrastructure had completely collapsed. No clean water, no transportation, and entire neighborhoods reduced to uninhabitable rubble. Tens of thousands of families were left without homes or shelter. Fields were destroyed, factories bombed out, and food distribution had halted. The streets swelled with the desperate and displaced, unsure of whether they would make it through the next week. People who had nothing to do with the Nazi regime still bore the weight of the nation's crimes. For many, hope died with the surrender. In the coming months, the country would be divided, stripped, and reshaped by foreign hands. But if the destruction inside Germany was overwhelming, what happened to Germans outside of Germany's new borders would be even more terrifying. Second, mass rapes and atrocities by Soviet troops. When Soviet troops stormed Berlin, what followed was a brutal campaign of retribution. In the eyes of many Red Army soldiers, German civilians were not innocent. They were the enemy. Historians estimate that between 1.4 and 2 million German women were raped in the months following Germany's defeat. Some women were assaulted repeatedly, with entire buildings becoming sites of mass sexual violence. Mothers were attacked in front of their children, and girls as young as 8 were not spared. Hospitals and churches turned into sanctuaries filled with traumatized survivors. But even those weren't always safe from armed intrusion. These actions weren't random or isolated. They were often condoned or ignored by Soviet commanders. Stalin himself brushed off reports, claiming his soldiers had earned the right to express their anger however they pleased. For many victims, their pain was compounded by lifelong silence, fearing shame, stigma, and disbelief. If what happened in Berlin was horrifying, imagine the fate of Germans living in former Nazi-occupied areas like Poland and Czechoslovakia, where locals had their own scores to settle. 3. The expulsion of 12 million Germans between 1945 and 1950. Over 12 million ethnic Germans were expelled from Eastern Europe. Entire communities who had lived for generations in Sudetenland, now Czechia, East Prussia, Silesia, and Hungarian territories were forced to leave behind everything they owned. These weren't Nazi officials or soldiers, just ordinary people. The expulsions were often violent. Germans were thrown out of their homes, sometimes with only minutes to gather belongings. Entire towns were emptied, and convoys of refugees were forced to march hundreds of miles. Children froze in the snow. Elderly men collapsed from exhaustion. Soldiers and militias opened fire on unarmed crowds, and thousands were beaten or tortured during the journey. On arrival in Germany, these refugees were seen as a burden. There were not enough homes, not enough food, and no one to help them cope with the trauma of losing everything. Some slept in barns. Others perished on the roadside, never reaching the supposed safe zone. But for those who remained within the Allied-controlled areas, was life any safer? Or did another form of brutality await them under a new kind of captivity? Fourth, Allied reprisals and internment camps. In the Western zones, including areas controlled by the United States, France, and Britain, life wasn't always humane either. While the world viewed the Allies as liberators, some of their post-war actions toward German POWs and civilians were alarmingly punitive. The Rheinwiesenlager camps, established by U.S. forces, held over 1 million German soldiers and civilians. Many were imprisoned without trials or formal charges. These camps had no barracks, no proper food supplies, and almost no sanitation. The prisoners were crammed into barbed wire enclosures, exposed to the elements, rain, sun, mud, and disease. While the U.S. government maintained that death rates were low, German sources suggest tens of thousands perished due to exposure, dysentery, and starvation. The dead were often buried in unmarked graves, their stories untold, their suffering undocumented. These weren't just soldiers. They included teenage boys from the Hitler Youth, civil servants, and even civilians rounded up without cause. It was punishment by association. If adults were treated this way, what about children? How did the war shape the lives of the youngest generation, those who were too small to understand it, but old enough to suffer its aftermath? 5. The starving children of post-war Germany. Post-war Germany saw an explosion in the number of orphans, street children, and undernourished kids. Many lost their families in the bombings or during the refugee expulsions. Some were abandoned. Others simply wandered from village to village, looking for food or shelter. Rationing meant children survived on bread crusts, boiled potatoes, or powdered soup, if they were lucky. In major cities like Frankfurt or Munich, international observers reported that up to 70% of children were malnourished. Some had never attended school or seen a doctor. Disease outbreaks ravaged young populations. Tuberculosis, lice infestations, dysentery, and pneumonia were common. In desperation, children resorted to begging soldiers, scavenging garbage, or stealing just to survive. These children, often called wolf children in Eastern territories, represent one of the most haunting legacies of post-war Europe. They grew up in a world without safety, without support, and in most cases, without parents. 6. Psychological and social consequences. The physical devastation was visible, but the psychological scars ran much deeper. Entire communities were traumatized. Families were broken. The concept of normal life disintegrated. Many survivors carried lifelong PTSD, anxiety, and survivor's guilt. For women, the trauma of rape often remained a secret, hidden from husbands, children, and society. For children, the lack of stability and education turned into lifelong emotional dysfunction. Mental illness increased, but treatment was rare. Suicide rates climbed. Post-war German society was forced to rebuild, not just economically, but morally and emotionally. It had to grapple with the horrors committed during the war, while also healing from the wounds inflicted after it ended. This paradox became part of Germany's complex identity, at once the perpetrator and the punished. It wasn't until the 1960s and 1970s that many of these stories even began to surface publicly. Until then, the silence was deafening. History is rarely simple. While Nazi Germany brought darkness to the world, millions of innocent Germans paid a price that was horrifying in its own right. Their stories matter, not to excuse the past, but to understand the full spectrum of human suffering that war creates. The brutal fate of Germans after 1945 is a reminder that justice without compassion can become cruelty, and that vengeance, no matter how justified, often leaves behind new victims. If you believe this part of history deserves to be remembered, share this video. Like, comment, and subscribe for more stories the history books often forget. And tell us, should history ever be one-sided?